Big Sky howdy, and welcome to an exciting and 2020 episode of World Bigfoot Radio. The reason I say 2020 is because whenever this comes out, it's the first recording that I've done in 2020, and we've got a very special repeat guest here with us today. Before I get to that, I'd like to just bring up a couple things. I'd really like to thank everybody that helped this channel survive during 2019. 2019 was really rough for me. As some of you know, I was in and out of the hospital. I had to move, and I had all kinds of other disasters happening here, and the support from the viewers and fans out there has been great. I really love you guys. God bless you all for helping, and I really appreciate it. Also, just a heads up, if you're not already aware of it, I'm doing a weekly radio show on tfrlive.com. That's on Saturday at 10 Pacific, and some of the content that I'm putting up there is not the same as what's on my regular YouTube channel. So it would behoove you to go over there and check it out. Also, if you're not there right when it plays, you're going to have to actually join TFR Live to get into the archives and get old shows that have already aired. Simultaneous to it airing, it's also on TuneIn, TalkStream Live, and iHeart platforms, so you can listen to it there too. But the only place it's archived is on TFR Live. Also like to thank all the people that just joined over on our Facebook group. Montana Bigfoot Project is our flagship over there on Facebook. As a lot of you know, we hit our goal and actually went a little bit beyond it, made it up to 4,500 members before New Year's. Thanks to all of you great new members that have joined over there. Really appreciate it. And if any of you want to be on the other main flagship support group, it's on the MeWe platform. It's World Bigfoot Central. And one last bit of news, one thing I'd like to mention is that last year and the year before, we lost a lot of the bigger names, the Bigfoot community, illness issues for the most part. And I'd like all of you to think about them and remember them in your prayers, and their families especially. Some of the guys, going back a couple of years, Mitch Waite, or Mogollon Monster, Dr. John Bindernagel, Robert Dodson, J.C. Johnson, Sasquatch Jim, and more recently Tim Fasano and Brenton Solon. They're going to be greatly missed in the community. They all put in a lot of great work and spent years and years trying to bring us good information and figure things out for us. And I hope you'll all remember their families in your prayers. And so with that, I would like to bring on our luminary and amazing guest for this episode. And I'm sorry for holding you up for a while waiting there in the wings. But welcome back to the show, Gary Wayne.
Well, happy to be back, and very much looking forward to the topic today. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure of it. Well, anytime I have you on, it's going to be a home run because you're the man with the knowledge on a lot of this stuff. And one of the things that I sort of primed you for is that, during this last year, I've been getting people directly contacting me that are having problems with the little people. And some of them are not very friendly. They're not Keebler elves. They're not, giving you a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow or anything. These are like little monsters. And so I thought we'd bring you on just to get the biblical perspective on what some of these things might be and where what they're coming from.
Yeah, so there is a tie-in, a very small tie-in from a biblical perspective, in terms of what Scripture might talk about them. So they're not sort of widely talked about in the Bible, but in terms of sort of concept of how they're would have been created and how the sort of global worldwide phenomena of little people, how it fits into prehistory and how it fits into all throughout history is a very, very common heritage, and it's a much larger topic than most people would give it credit for. And in fact, it's kind of one of those global historic sort of legacies and legends and mythologies that is very, very similar to Bigfoot or giants and pyramids and mystical religions and everything like that. It has these similar parallel tracks of history and significant crossover connections. So it's a very, very, very large topic. So we'll probably talk more about the greater sort of fairy understanding, and understanding that there's different categories of fairies, and there's 4 sort of major groups of fairies that would include what they call the alien fairy race that rebelled and came from another planet, and they're very much like the fallen angels in the Bible, and they're led by the proud angel. And after the rebellion, they went into these holes, similar to things that you would hear about fairies and or with the Nephilim. And the second category then is like the giants, the earthly ones. These are the shining ones as opposed to the opalescent ones, which are the angelic sort of ones. And again, very, very similar to the shining race of the Anunnaki and the Mesopotamian shining ones, and in fact have a direct connection back to that as the tribe of Danu through the Tuatha De Danann out of Ireland and England and Norway and Germany, and again where all the elves sort of mythology sort of comes from. And then you have the classification of the daemons or the shaves or the banshees, and these are the spirits of the fairies, and typically the connection there would be the bodiless spirits of the Nephilim. Then you have this very interesting fourth category called the elementals, and the fourth category are the little ones, and they're broken into three categories, and those categories are kind of the same right around the world. And so the first category, just to give people sort of an overview on this of the little people, of the elementals, these are the good-looking ones who tend to take care of people. And, you know, they're ones that people might recognize as, you know, small elves or nymphs, and these are the good elves as opposed to the dark elves. Nereids out of
garden gnomes and things like that would also fall into that.
Well, gnomes is a different category, but these are good-looking ones. Gnomes are typically uglier ones. Mermaids would fall into that. In North America, like the dogwood people would be part of that sort of group. And there's many different names of little people within the native community. So I'm just sort of naming one to put in there. And the second category, quickly, is the category you're referring to, is the ugly category. And these are the gnomes. These are the various kinds of goblins, the dark elves, hobbits, trolls, and of course the rock people, who, you know, are all part of the group that steal children. And again, there's more names in these ones, but those are typically the ones that are talked about. And and another thing about these sort of classifications of these little people, and they're similar all over the world in their classifications and in the three groupings, is they all have specific roles that they do and play. And so we'll probably come around to some of that a little bit later. Dwarves would be part of that ugly group as well. And you also have what they call the trickster ones. And the trickster ones are like pixies and some goblins, brownies, imps, menehue out of Hawaii, the laurel people out of America, and also probably the Pukwudgies, I would think that you would put in there as well. So anyways, those are kind of the basic groupings as they are identified, whether it's in Europe or with American traditions or Southeast Asia or wherever. This is a tradition that's known everywhere. But the question is how do they relate sort of biblically? We'd only get one reference to little people in all of the Bible, and that would be in Ezekiel 27 and verse 11. And it's people called the Gamadin, that are a warrior class of people that are working along the walls and defending the city of Tyre in Ezekiel 27. And that goes back to a particular word that is rooted in the I am on the end is the male plural. So it's a race of people. And the original word is gamad, and that means a cubit or a span. So somewhere between, in the old measurement, somewhere between 9 to 11 inches to 18 to 22 inches. So almost like pygmy type people. So we get one reference to the little people, whether or not they're the pygmies out of Africa or they're part of the fairy accounting of peoples. We don't get any other sort of descriptions of them, but we do get, as part of the hierarchy of beings that are created and or rebelled from God, there's a hierarchy that exists there. And so the ones that are created by the fallen angels, Nephilim or Anunnaki or Xibalba or Daitria or Myosea of China, whichever name you want, they're all the different giants. And these are the ones who fit in the hierarchy as demigods, and then after their bodies die, they're like the demon spirits. Similar, again, almost identical to what the four fairy categories are. But within this group, there's a group that's called elements and elementals in the group. And what's interesting about that is, and if somebody's looking at a King James version, you might see the word as rudiments, and in other English translations, it probably will say elements or elementals. And that's in the book of Galatians, in 2 Peter, in 2 Colossians, where these verses that I'm sort of talking about, and I won't drag everybody through those verses, but I can give them to you if you want them.
Yes,
just get a hold of me. And so get a hold of me by email through my website, and I'll gladly give that out to people. So rudiment, as it comes up in the King James Version Bible, actually goes back to something orderly in arrangement, or and is classified as part of the beings of this organizational structure, as being part of the rebellious governing organizational structures that rebelled from God. So when we look at how that sort of crosses over and how polytheist religions will look at the elementals, then we start to see, a lot more sort of connections and understanding of what they're talking about. And these are considered a part of the offspring of the gods. They are considered the lowest level or the lower levels of that sort of hierarchy of the gods. And, they'll include all the different names that you're talking about, and they're created by the gods to do certain roles, as what we talked about earlier. And they're
like in the case of elementals or nature spirits or something like that. They have a spirit.
Yeah. Well, like gnomes would be a really good example. And they're created to protect the knowledge. And they're there to protect the technology and guard the genealogies and the history. And so they're very much part higher up in the organizational structure in terms of that sort of agenda role. And just as what you see, let's say in Lord of the Rings, you have the dwarves who live in the ground in the mountains, and they make weapons and tools and do ironsmith and stuff like that, and smelting. And again, that was their job, to supply the weapons to the Nephilim, who were running the governments and the kingships and the dynasties, and ruling over people, and leading themselves in war against each other and with humans. So they all had a role that they were created to do. And so they're kind of like a greater part of that whole Nephilim concept and part of the whole sort of infrastructure.
Very interesting. I have a guest who's been on the show several times, and basically all they do is just research on the little people. And they've broken it down into several categories, and they absolutely don't have anything to do with the Fae, what we would think of as the fairies and the elves and that sort of thing. Don't even research it. They research what they call proto-pygmies, which basically are in two useful categories for our purposes, which is hostile and non-hostile. And the goblinoids pretty much go into the hostile group across the board. Yeah. And some of them are sort of like what you were talking about with the gnomes, where you can have ones that are actually, sort of helpful, that are maybe taking care of the local woods or guarding knowledge or something like what you're talking about. And then other ones like the red caps that are murderous little monsters that you don't want to be around at all.
Yeah. Yep. And this is the group that steals children and does experimentation on them. And another interesting aspect of that, and when we talked about those trickster ones, those are like the leprechauns and ones like that, right? So,
well, just curious here before we go on, what category would you put like the gray neighbors in the UK into?
Yeah, those are the gnomes.
So they fall in the gnome category because the descriptions, man, they sound like gray aliens from the description.
They do, and I put a description of them in my book. And if you didn't know that I was describing a gray neighbor or gray gnome abduction, you would swear it was a gray alien encounter.
Right. And the creepy thing about this is this goes back to way before any kind of UFO mythology or alien abductions or anything.
All throughout our history.
Any clue. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what they did was they came out of these portals or fairy mounds and with flying machines. And they would kidnap children for a fortnight or 14 days. And then
2 weeks, yeah.
And then they would return them, and people wouldn't have any memories on them. But in the last few centuries or so, through hypnosis and things, they would start to, uncover some of those images, and they are identical to in description and in what they do to what the gray aliens do. And they're literally described as, one of these, gray alien encounters, they're described as goblin-like beings, which is part of that gnome
bingo
sort of description. Yeah, like, and they have wrinkled skins and large eyes, and again, I think all that's gone on is they were called something different before people started to understand in the last couple of years what technology was really all about and what it could do, right? So it's just sort of understanding them into the context of where the technological advancement was at the time of the seeing of them. And then when that you start to connect those dots, that starts to open up so many other just sort of avenues as to, well, wait a minute. These things have been around all throughout history and are so much part of world history, and particularly as it's held in fairy tales and in descriptions in science fiction with these type of beings, and or things like Lord of the Rings or the Narnia tales, and on and on and on and on and on. Even with Shakespeare, you have the recollection of these beings that are connected somehow to the giants. So let's say in Midsummer's Night Dream, where you have these interesting kind of fairies, you also have King Oberon, which is a term out of the Tuatha De Danann, who were giants, and he's the king of the fairies. And the Tuatha De Danann, as I mentioned, were known as the shining fairy people. And his wife is Titania, and Titania would be a female, and Titania would be a female giant. And so you get these so interesting sort of connections that are being drawn on, and Shakespeare drew his knowledge, if indeed it was actually Shakespeare, not Bacon, but that's another rabbit hole, but drew his knowledge on, the writers of the classics, whether or not it was Ovides with Metamorphoses out of Rome, or, writers like Homer and Hesiod and all the great writers. He drew on that to write his plays, as well as, putting his, other interesting concepts and genealogies and belief systems all throughout his work.
Wow. Yeah, that's one thing that people don't really think of very much. You grow up with this sort of thing, and, you've got Disney and Tinkerbell and all these other little sort of myths and stuff that you grow up with as a kid. You don't really pay any attention to it. And then you start seeing that there's abject connections to reality with all this stuff, and it gets real creepy real fast. And it's kind of hard to avoid the little person subject, because just as much as that giant myths are universal, they're everywhere. It's the same thing with the little people. You can go up to the Arctic Circle, and the Eskimo have the Chinnerak, and you can go down to the southern tip of South Africa, and they've got the Yumbos. There's little people everywhere.
Everywhere. It's common world, legacy, and most people don't realize that. It's in, all cultures, all continents around the world, except for Antarctica. Who knows what we'll find down there down the road? And just throw that out to
Arctic
raise a few
elves
eyebrows.
probably.
And you've got gods that come out of mythology. Like Diana, who is also connected to the Tuatha De Danann of Ireland, but out of Italy, where the goddess Diana is, she's the goddess of fairies, right? She creates these little nymphs and water nymphs and nature nymphs and a whole variety of these beings. And just as in whether it's Greek or it's in other cultures, you have this creation going back to gods having an offspring with things to create these other beings. And, of course, they did other things as well, but, like the centaurs and things like that. But but again, you have the same story, whether or not that's a DNA manipulation or whatever is going on, and crossbreeding maybe 3 different species, including humans in there, right? Humans, the gods, and something else. And so there could be technology that's involved in that, because like the centaurs, for example, are created in a cloud off the earth. And that, is a very strange place to have a race that is going to be created. And that's not an unusual sort of concept as you go through these various legends and things around the world.
Yeah, that's so much of that makes me wonder, and especially in some parts of the seemingly excluded for a reason Apocrypha, some of it I can see why they excluded. But it seems that the more you look at it with the modern perspective, the more a lot of it seems like they're talking about technology, but they just don't have the nomenclature to explain it in terms we would understand.
Yeah, exactly. And then you get a lot of other things that are kind of muddying it up. So when you get into some of the deeper things in terms of what I'm talking about in my book, you get into what I call the allegorical symbolisms of the fairies are. And you have a matriarchal branch of the bloodlines of the Nephilim that, goes back to people like Lilith and Mary. And Mary, that's Mary Magdalene that I'm talking about, and Miriam from the time of Moses, and others. And this is what they call the matriarchal bloodline, and in the occult religions. And what's so interesting about that is they call that the fairy bloodline. And to start a new dynasty, they would use a significant new ennobled fairy matriarch to start a new dynasty with. And so the patriarchal bloodline, just to give the reverse side, is the dragon bloodline, and or raven bloodline. So owl and fairy are the allegories. And you see that fairy thing that come up when you get into tales of the Grail and King Arthur. Of course, the Grail is more about bloodlines and the genealogy of those bloodlines, and you get these fairy queens, like Guinevere, and she's has a descendancy back to the Tuatha De Danann, and just as Arthur is a son of Uther Pendragon, and is a Pendragon again, their genealogies go back to the Tuatha De Danann. So you have that as an allegory that sort of muddies things up in terms of people trying to sort of sift through and say, what's going on with these fairies, and then how do you have fairy godmothers and things, and what does that really mean? And you got to understand that language is more symbolic, but we also need to understand that there were indeed giant fairies as well, and those were some of the good-looking elves, and as they're kind of more portrayed in Lord of the Rings as one of that species that's this very pale-looking species, and they're not shown as a giant, but typically in the pure Norse version of those large giants, they would have been actually giants. And I think they're actually, considered part of that Nephilim race. They may be somewhat distinct from them, but again, that Nephilim type of being. And again, you get those ties that go back.
That brings up an interesting thing that I'd be curious to get your opinion on, and that's of course, the tie-in of Third Reich working with the Nordic aliens. And those Nordic aliens tend to look a lot like the description of the big tall elves. What do you think about that one?
Yep, and that's exactly, again, part of that whole sort of Volkish ideology that they also included the Vril ideology of something in the blood that was forming their whole Aryan belief system. And that goes back to, and also had a Thule society because their recollection of prehistory, that they take their history from, that they're the true Aryans, and these were the Aryans that were the people that lived in Thule, which could be a separate primordial or antediluvian prehistoric civilization parallel to Atlantis, or it could be the same, or it could be more Asgard, right, as it comes out of the Norse mythology. But these are the Aryans that come out, and these are the people that they believe that they descended back, and they actually thought that they could re-engineer with technology the Vril bloodline, and the Vril comes out of the Rosicrucian belief system, which holds the Gnostic beliefs that goes back to, includes the Cathars and the Albigensians and a global cosmology, but understanding out of the Cathar belief system that they believe that the elven race is the elven bloodline of the Tuatha De Danann that's going to produce Antichrist. But that's another allegorical rabbit hole we probably shouldn't go down today. But it's part of the bloodlines that are, recorded in King Arthur. But back to the Nazis. So these are the Aryans that survived the flood. They come out of the Scythia area, out of Tartarus is where the belief is that they escaped from. And there are two distinct segments of these that are also known as the tribe of Danu. If you remember earlier, I was talking about a connection of the Tuatha De Danann back to Anu and the Anunnaki, and An is heaven in Sumerian, and they're the offspring. The earthborn Anunnaki are the offspring of the sons of heaven, or gods, or aliens, depending on which mythos that you're going to go down. And so these are the ones that escape out of Scythia, and the tribe of Danu that also settle into the Mesopotamian region, but they also migrate north up the Danube and into Russia, into Germany, into Sweden, into Norway. And the other branch migrates over to Ireland and England and Scotland. And the distinction is that the ones over in Ireland are red-haired and hazel-eyed with very pale skin. And the ones that migrated north are the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned survivors. And these are identical descriptions to what North American natives would describe the White Snake Clan that, settled North America. They're the same description as what the Aztecs or the Quiché Maya would describe, who first started their race after the flood, and the same description as in the Atlantean legends, with that same sort of color and description. Of course, they had more of a serpentine face, and that's sort of another link back. So you can imagine like an Akhenaten type of character with a protruded chin and high cheekbones and these big, large, sort of almost wraparound eyes like the aliens or the gray aliens might have, and of course the elongated skull. And these are the people that the Nazis based their whole new Reichschurch religion around, these blue-eyed, blonde-haired Aryans, and the same people that they're trying to recreate through genetics moving forward through intermarriage and selection of what they would have deemed a more pure version as they could to intermarry and to create this new man concept. And that new man concept that they're trying to do is to create the new Nephilim. And so it's amazing how they adopt all of that into their web of theology called Ariosophy, as it is an extension of theosophy that went rogue, and that went rogue with how they used it and how they introduced Volkish and Vril ideology on top of it. And the knowledge that the Nazis get comes from a realm of people that they describe exactly as you say, as we would understand as aliens, or as these gray neighbor or gnomes that are fairies, and that they provide the knowledge, which then gives an explanation for how a bankrupt nation, when Hitler comes to power in 1933, develops blitzkrieg strategy for a new type of war with new technology of tanks, with the Panzer tanks and the Tiger tanks that is still the design being used today for the most part, that nobody else had. They are able to create things like rockets and jet engines and all of this technology that is just not possible in that short period of time, and yet they attribute that to the aliens or the spirit realm or the ascended masters or the White Brotherhood, whatever name that people want to call them, because they're all talking about the same group of people in that hierarchy that I talked about earlier that were providing them and feeding them the knowledge. And again, it's just amazing how this mythos just sort of continues throughout history and continues to today. So maybe mythos is not the correct word, other than it's an ever-lifting, it's a reality.
The history.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing I always found curious is knowing a little bit about what they actually were trying to make for their new old religion there in Germany. If I recall correctly, one of the things that came up a bunch was Hyperborea. And I always wondered if Hyperborea was actually just Doggerland, which of course sank, which would be where the North Sea was, and in between the Ireland, Scotland, England, that whole area. And if that's what they were actually referring to.
You know, I think so, as because they would have gone with a very, very pure recollection of their history. And so they wouldn't want to be importing much from other legends and mythology.
Right. Well, the other thing that was interesting is they were doing all this racial heritage stuff, and they were sending teams all over the world doing, you know, like take the forceps and put it on their head and take measurements and stuff like that, and different size, you know, shapes of faces and everything. And they were, again, looking for this whole Aryan root thing. And like what you were talking about with breeding programs, which most people don't know about or pay attention to nowadays, there's massive breeding programs in Germany. And so their concept was basically that the original Aryan that they were trying to breed themselves back to was more or less the Nephilim. They were trying to get rid of the human in their bloodline and get themselves back to being Nephilim again.
Yes. They wanted to recreate the glory of old. And so that, you know, they wanted the Third Reich or 1,000-year reign that they were going to dominate the world with. And again, that's this sort of Atlantean idea where Atlantis was trying to conquer the world, and they had 10 various groups within their empire that were trying to militarily take over the world. So again, really playing on that ancient common sort of prehistory, but specifically from Thule, or what I think more is Asgard or Hyperborea, which you're talking about in the North Sea. And again, you see that North mythology really come out in Lord of the Rings, because he overlaid the Norse ideology on that whole fairy mythology when he created the Lord of the Rings. And, you know, yeah, actually he even kind of added to it where he created that they would call these demi-humans, whether or not it's like the orcs, which are, you know, part human, part something else. And it could be, you know, part like a gnome or, you know, another kind of little people or something else even. So.
Yeah, well, that was like the Hobbits, too. I mean, he kind of made them up out of the whole cloth, but what did he base it on? The same descriptions for centuries of little people. They were just an amalgam of like several kinds of little people, and well, you know, call them hobbits, whatever.
Yeah.
But, you know, you're absolutely right about that. And there was a lot. One thing, I actually did some studying on that, too, because I was sort of interested in it. And he was actually very slavish about trying to go back to the root origins of mythologies, folklore, and using that as the template for the races that he had. So when he's talking about the dwarves or something, they're really close to what the you know, mythological descriptions are. The elves are really close to what the mythological descriptions are.
Yeah. So there's a lot of detail in there that's probably accurate. You know, some of the tales that go along with it, that's going to hold that detail and understanding is, you know, maybe just to make the narrative. But in the fairy tale concept, the interesting narrative that's on the surface isn't the true meaning, and you need to understand the allegories and the details to get the true history.
Right.
And again, that's the whole fairy tale concept. And typically, you need to be an adept of the polytheist religions or the occult religions to understand the real story, and that's sort of the basis of the fairy tale concept. So there's going to be a lot of truth in there, and you just have to, you know, sort of know how to pull it out, I guess, or be taught how to pull that information out.
Yeah, you have to know enough of tons of background information that you can sort through it. That's the problem. That's what we need you for, Gary, because we can't figure that stuff out. We don't have a super brain like you do.
Yeah. And another interesting thing about, you know, connecting different things, whether or not it's aliens or it's ghosts and demons and Nephilim and stuff like that, is something called a fairy domen, which is like a Shay, S-I-D-H-E. And Shay is also a demon spirit, so it's got a few different meanings, just as there's also a Tuatha De Danann people called the Shay people. But when I'm talking about the fairy domens, though, domen actually means portal. And these are like little mini megalithic structures like Stonehenge, but they're one single sort of unit. So basically two huge rocks with another one on top, and they're freestanding. And these are portals. And what's interesting about that is that you get this connection with, people may not be familiar with it, but it's called Yigal Rephaim, which is in the Golan Heights. And it's this wheel circular sort of figure. And Gigal actually means wheel and or circuits, and I think there was many sites, but there's hundreds of these little domens that are actually in there. And what's interesting is you get out of the Ugaritic texts, when they're talking about their Rapium or the Rapiu, depending on which transliteration that you're using, these were the travelers that would, and the transliteration for what comes up in Hebrew as Rephaim, which is the post-Diluvian or after the flood giants, as opposed to the antediluvian giants, which are the Nephilim giants. Whatever the distinction is, they're called differently. And so these are the portals that the Rapiu would travel back and forth from. And again, you have a similar structure within this and very, very similar to the Stonehenge circular thing, but there's more circles within it. That has these domen structures that look like those outer rim of Stonehenge, which looks exactly as their individual units as a fairy domen. And there was hundreds of these domens or portals where seemingly these giants travel back and forth from the underworld. And again, that understanding of underworld is usually deeply connected with the little people, because they either go through back and forth between the underworld through these domen portals or through caves, and they have that sort of intersection with similar caves to where Bigfoot tend to live at times, and in the mountains. And so again, you get these connections that you can't always reach out and make it palpable and touch, but you can sort of visually see there's so many things going on here that is way too consistent to be coincidence.
No kidding. And speaking of dolmens, and here's a little plug for tourism here in Montana. About an hour drive from where I'm sitting right now is a Giants Playground. It's over by the capital, Helena. And one of the megaliths that is in the Giants Playground is the Tizer Dolmen, which is the largest one on Earth. It's 60 feet tall.
Yeah, amazing.
Go look it up. It's scary. I want to get over there and do some video, because there's a whole bunch of stuff over there. And just a side note, one of the places we do Bigfoot research, we've been finding megaliths up there, and they're not even documented. So there's a tie-in between all this stuff. Yeah, and I think it people ask me, okay, if there was a flood, then how do these things show up after the flood? Well, they're either recreated again after the flood, just like giants were recreated after the flood, or they survived the flood, possibly how giants survived the flood as well. And if they survived, how
I lean more towards, second creations by the fallen angels, but but by the ones that weren't put into the abyss, because only the impassioned and most evil ones went into the abyss for the crimes for before the flood. So there's fallen angels still around after the flood. But if they survive somehow, just as we get like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or with Deucalion in the Greek version and Pyrrha, I mean, these are survival stories of giants. Upnapishtim, that's recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is 2/3 god and 1/3 human. And he's a giant, and his whole family is a giant, and he's an archetypical giant. And Deucalion is and Upnapishtim is created by the gods, so as an offspring. And Deucalion is the son of Prometheus, as I recall, and so again, offspring of the gods again. So either somehow on an ark, which is one version, but you also get Amakaseth coming out of some of the Gnostic religions that was taken by a cloud off Earth to survive. And then you get all of these interesting sort of discussions about perhaps somehow in the Earth with these underground cities that they're finding all over the place, whether or not it's the one over in Turkey, Global Techie, and I know I butchered that.
Göbekli Tepe,
yeah, Göbekli Tepe. Yeah.
They just recently found another one over there that they think is about the same age, so this isn't like the only one.
Yeah, and there's so many of these underground city sites that they're finding that people are thinking, well, maybe people somehow survived after the flood. I mean, that would take some technology to create oxygen and stuff like that, but I mean,
well, it depends. Think about it for a minute. We both know that a lot of these things are either underground, lived underground sometimes, or they're exclusively and come up occasionally. Okay, so we got that. So the whole Earth is going to be flooded. Well, you know what? I bet at least one of them had a watertight door. And there's some really big caverns underground, easily big enough that they could hold enough air for a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I agree with you. I was just watching one of your shows the other night, and I just wanted to let you know I'm totally on board with your opinion on Olga Bashan clinging to the side of the ark. I do not believe that could have happened.
That sounds a little fantastic.
Yeah, that's stretching it a lot, because he would have been clinging for a long time there,
Yeah, he would have. Yeah. So again, probably a different way of how that happened. But because we don't have a smoking gun verse, we kind of have to be open that all possibilities are there. But that's kind of way down the list. And the other possibility is most of the survival comes with help from either the gods or the fallen angels. And so did they get some help going through some of these portals or something like that to survive? And if the little people, controlled these portals, then, or if the fairies as a whole controlled the portals, and just as you've got allegorized in King Arthur, you've got the ladies of the lake, which is are fairies, and there's a lot of portals in underground waters, and they were designated as guardians of those portals and waters. As you take that mythology back, then why couldn't some of these beings, or many of these beings, have been saved through going through the portals, either into the underworld physically, which I don't quite agree with, but possibility. But I would look at the underworld as being in the earth, but in another dimension. So same location, but basically a different wavelength, or however you want to describe that.
Totally agree with you on that one. And in fact, I think the majority of these so-called aliens from other worlds aren't from other worlds. They're from our world on a different vibrational frequency. All they have to do is change their frequency, and bingo, bango, they're here. Their little UFO fades in. Oh, where'd that come from? Well, it came from here. It just faded in because it's now on our frequency.
Yeah, and we're just learning about different dimensions today. So science is so far behind. Although I'm also open to the idea that there's a lot more known behind the scenes than what's being released to us in terms of understanding some of that. But that no matter how you look at that, that's about 100 years old in terms of understanding different dimensions and quantum mechanics that went along with it. And what's interesting about that sort of connection is now you have all of the major pioneers of quantum mechanics and understanding quantum computing basically saying, if you want to understand this, you have to go and read the Upanishads and various Vedas out of the Hindu religion, so you have an understanding of what we're dealing with, so that your thinking is right. And so all of them were immersed in the ancient history of a specific religion for their understanding as pioneers creating our understanding of dimensions. It's, again, you couldn't make this stuff up. It just people wouldn't believe it, but it's true.
Yeah, I know. That's the weird thing. All this stuff keeps looping around and referencing itself all the time, and other weird things. Science keeps referencing supernaturals referencing science. The two are getting closer. Well, the more you study the really advanced theories of physics and stuff, I mean, that reads like a book on high magic or something at this point. It's ridiculous how tied in it is with it.
Yeah, it is. And again, that just sort of tells me that when you have these holy scriptures from those religions that have this information that's in it, it just tells you that this is not new. It was here before, and we're just catching up to that.
Yeah. Or, from our perspective, everything has to be logical, scientific, and make sense. So what's really going on is that it's stuff that was already known. They're just figuring out the nomenclature to describe it. What are the mechanics of it? How does it work mathematically? That's what they're doing. It's not anything new. They're just quantifying it.
Yep, they're quantifying it, and just as the Nazis were trying to do, is backwards engineer so that they could, have that again. Because again, they do that in every sort of aspect of all the different sciences and what they'd like to create for, godlike beings on the earth, because that's what they're really trying to do with all this technology of cloning and transhumanism and AI. That's all sort of merging, that they want to, extend human life to be like the ages recorded in the Bible and in other religions with the gods and the demigods.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's a really creepy stuff. Again, I should remind everybody that you turned out an amazing book that covers all this stuff and way, way more. And it's called
The Genesis 6 Conspiracy: How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. And it's got more information in it than one can imagine, and you can't speed read it. If you do, I think you might pop some brain cells. Every sentence, every paragraph, every chapter is loaded with information, and it never stops coming. But it's written in a way that it's a mini story in every chapter that leads into the next chapter, and the chapters average about 6 pages or so. So you can come back to those chapters and reread it, or you can read it at the pace that you can absorb the information. But it just if you're after information on a whole bunch of things that connect so many dots in this world, that's going to be a book that interests you. If you want an easy read, not a book that's for you.
No, for our purposes, for World Bigfoot Central and World Bigfoot Radio, it is on the highly recommended list. So if you haven't seen it, if you don't have a copy, I recommend you go get yourself one, because it is totally worth it. And you'll have lots and lots and lots of interesting stuff to go over. And when you have one of these questions about how does this stuff connect, well, there's your reference book. Go check it out, because Gary did all the legwork for you and spent 30 years putting it together. It's a totally awesome book. Make sure it's in your library. Now, the other thing now, well, we were talking about, before we get looped back around with little people again, one thing you mentioned that the Nordics in Northern Europe, especially like in Ireland, you have the hazel-eyed and red-haired, really fair people, and then most of the rest of the Nordic countries, the blonde, blue-eyed people. This sort of weird thing comes up with the giants, too, where most of the giants in North America are described as being fair-skinned, red-haired, and very hostile. And now this also comes up with Bigfoot, where people, and we've got thousands, if not tens of thousands of Bigfoot reports at this point. It seems like the ones with red hair are more aggressive than the ones with black hair. Can you shed any light on that?
Not really. I mean, typically when it comes to the giants, I mean, they're all essentially aggressive. I mean, I know in like Greek accounts and things like that, you have, good heroes and bad heroes.
There's
But
actually stories here from North America of some of the giants siding with the natives when they had their big showdown with the giants here in North America, according to their
yeah,
legend. And it
yeah,
was
well,
actually the smaller ones, the ones that were more in the 7 to 9 foot range, seemed like they had more of an attitude like the humans did and wanted to side with them, and they all ganged up on the bigger ones and got rid of them.
yeah. And typically when you get those intermediate size, those what I would call hybrid Rephaim humans. So you have the purebred ones that were the offspring of the gods or fallen angels, and then you have them starting to intermix with the humans, which creates an intermediate size. And that's what's quite common. Like in the Bible, you have the Canaanite tribes where you have Sidon and Heth, who are the sons of Canaan, but then you have these families of giants that they don't have a patriarch, and everybody comes off the ark has one of 70 names listed for all of the nations. These ones don't have any patriarchs, just as Rephaim or the Avim or the Hivim and all the different names for these Rephaim tribes after the flood aren't listed in the table of nations. And so what would have happened is that one of females from the descendants of Canaan, Sidon, and Heth would have intermarried with a Nephilim or Rephaim, I'm sorry, to create this new nation of hybrids that were taller than humans but not as big as the original Rephaim. And that's why you don't have a patriarch name given there. And, classic example might be Arba, who is listed in the Bible, who is the father of the Anakim or the Anak, but he doesn't show up anywhere in the Table of Nations, but lived in the same area as where these hybrid humans came from. So I think that's a classic example of what we're talking about. So it doesn't surprise me that the intermediate ones may side with humans as opposed to the purebred ones, right? Because there's this hierarchy of pedigree that's always with the original giants and their descendants thereafter, which is why they continue to intermarry in the royal bloodlines, right? To keep that bloodline pure and that genealogy with a pedigree that they could take back into prehistory that establishes their place in the overall hierarchy around the world. So that doesn't surprise me. And again, though, you have that red hair, that shows up with not only in North America, but also in South America with the Peruvian skulls that they've been finding. And that also matches up with Tuatha De Danann. I'm not sure where the migration comes from or who was the source of who. You could look at it from two different perspectives. But again, that's a sort of a commonality on it. And yeah, and I guess I would say if I was going to make a link on that, if you had blonde-haired Sasquatch or Bigfoot, I would suspect they would be quite aggressive as well. And
we do actually get reports of blonde-haired Sasquatch, and to my knowledge, they're not significantly any different than the other ones. It's only the red-haired ones that stand out as being very crabby. Hardly ever get any reports of somebody seeing one of those where it isn't making a fuss or throwing something at them or trying to chase them out of the woods.
Yeah, and so I was also thinking, like, sometimes you get descriptions of Yeti in the lighter hair color, and I was wondering, just making that connection, because I hadn't heard this what you were talking about with the dark-haired ones. And typically, the dark hair would come from the humans.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you would think so. And, the DNA study that Melba did tends to back that up, too, that the ones she got the samples from were hybrids. They're, human, female mother, and question mark, we don't know what it is, male father. So...
Yeah, I'm not convinced that Bigfoot is Nephilim, but I think they're a different creation. I think we might have covered this off in the last show we did. That is that greater sort of Nephilim concept of these beings that were created, but I think distinct from the Rephaim or the Nephilim. So I wouldn't view them as hybrid humans and Nephilim. I think Bigfoot and Sasquatch are distinct, but with perhaps some other interbreeding that takes place after that.
Yeah, well, it points out to the fact that if there are hybrids of them, and there are, there must be an original something, and they're probably still around that hasn't actually bred with humans yet. The original, what'd you call them, a pureblood. So, I mean, that tells you that genetically they've got to be fairly close to humans if they can actually interbreed with us and produce viable offspring, whether they're, sterile or not, like a mule.
Yeah. And again, you go back to, how these types of beings were created, from the gods, and humans were involved, whether or not it's, direct or as, a third ingredient into the mix. So, again, I think over time, knowledge and science will prove a lot of that correct. And I think we're seeing more of that as we go. But dealing with the reality of what that means, that'll shake the world.
Yeah. Well, it's let's see. Let's loop back around to the little people again. So on the subject of the little people, and again, we don't need to really focus on the fairies or anything here, because for the purposes of my audience, we're more worried about ones that are going to come and pester you and cause you problems and try and steal your kid and eat your dog and stuff like that. So of those, it seems like, from what I understood from what you said, that there's more than one source for these things. In other words, some of them are probably divine creations of the Lord, and other ones are GMO things that the Nephilim made while they were busy wrecking up the place. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think they're all created illegally.
Okay, so you don't think there were any elemental spirits before they created them?
No, I don't. I think it all comes from an extension out of the gods and the fallen angels somehow, some way.
Okay. Well, to my way of thinking, I would think that God would have had those same, you're working for me and I need somebody to take care of the forest here. That's your job. And then maybe when the Nephilim were down here, they bullied him and went, hey, you're working for us now, pal. This is our planet.
I mean, I think there's a good argument that could be the case, that these beings were also created at the same time, but they also rebelled, like the Nakash or the serpent did in Eden, and went along with the rebellious angels, right?
So do you think that there's some of the little people that didn't fall into that category and didn't rebel? The reason I ask this question is because their behavior, even if you're looking at it from a nefarious viewpoint, like what are they up to, and it's got to be something bad, it doesn't always work out that way. Some of them are like friends with families for generations and are actually helpful, but the majority of them have nefarious purpose, it seems like, and a lot of them are just downright evil, nasty little monsters.
Yeah, and just as you have good magic and black magic, or I guess it's white magic and black magic, you have white elves and dark elves. You have this sort of dualism that not all are working against humans. Some actually are trying to help, but they're still, as my perspective would come from it, from a Christian perspective, is they would still be rebellious angels. Right. Or offspring of the angels, even though they may not want to continue. But I would also say this, that if they believed in, from a Christian perspective, if they do exist and they are doing good things, if they could be saved if they believed in Jesus and in God. So I mean, I wouldn't want people to think that I totally write them off. But I also know that typically, as we get the accounts coming out through all the different mythologies and information about them, is they typically still work within that organization, right? Even though some are not, adversarial to humans. So I am open-minded to that, but I'm not convinced of it either, though.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I haven't got really good evidence pointing me in any direction that I can put my hand on and go, okay, I've got enough right here to believe that this is what's going on. No, not on that page. Another thing here that was brought up, Barbara W. wanted me to ask you, outside of Genesis 6:6, can you please give places in the Bible or the Apocryphal books that mention the fallen angels corrupting all flesh. And right off the bat, let me say first Enoch. But go ahead, Gary.
Well, yeah, that would be, from a Christian perspective, that would be one of the apocryphal books that would talk about that. You also have, books that come out of the Old King James Version. You have in the Book of Wisdom and the Book of Tobit that has a few references to the giants, but not a whole lot. But certainly in if you're talking about the creation, but if you're looking at within the Bible, there is significant references to the giants after the flood. And it's all throughout the Exodus. So if you're into the Book of Numbers, beginning, let's say, the Book of Numbers in 13 chapter, it's going to talk about the spies that go into the covenant land and they see, three kings of the Anakim. And then when you get into Deuteronomy, and the giants, and also taller people, the hybrids, which are the Canaanite tribes that I was talking about that intermarried with the Rephaim. And in Deuteronomy 2, you have many of the various names listed, whether or not it's Avim or Anakim, they're all considered giants. And giant, when you take that back in the King James Version Bible back to Hebrew, is the word Rapha, and the male plural is Raphaim, the I am male plural, and it's defined as a tribe of giants. And so all of these names that people don't recognize as giants, including Hivim and Horim and Zamzuzim and on and on and on that's listed in the Bibles, are actually giant peoples. So that's the biggest collection of references to giants is in Joshua, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. And then you get a few more references of these as you get into the book of Samuel with David and Goliath and the giants that they are slaughtering there. And this is where the Avim also lived. And the Avim also has some Minoan and Crete giants that are also intermixed in their web of military cities and a pentapolis type of military structure. And so, yeah, that would be the bulk is in that section there. But outside the Bible, with the accepted apocryphal, you can only go to the King James Version in the Book of Wisdom and Tobit and Baruch. There's another reference in Baruch. And then the lesser accepted ones are like, First Enoch, which I think runs 99% congruent with the Bible, but I think it's got a few corruptions in it as it's come down the line. Not a lot, but I like First Enoch a lot. Second Enoch, Third Enoch, Book of Giants, that's, they're not very trustworthy at all. Book of Yashar isn't trusted, but Yashar, talks about it. Book of Jubilees talks about it. You get into almost any of the Dead Sea Scroll books, they're going to talk about in the various ones, whether they're Gnostic or Apocryphal Christian, they're going to talk about giants. So there's a wide bank of knowledge that's out there, but outside the Bible, there's not a whole bunch that you could sort of line up in terms of being recognized scripture.
Right, and some of the stuff might be viable information, but one of the reasons that a lot of it isn't trusted or included as canon is because the signs point to it having been written after the period that it's ascribed to. So in other words, they may have still had some good information on that period, but it wasn't actually written when they said it was.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's they call it a doubted authority or accuracy. And so and the thing is with the Book of Enoch, as an example, is you have an Aramaic version of it and you have a Ge'ez version of it. And I recommend getting the Ge'ez version because it has a little bit more. But there is no original Hebrew version to verify it.
Oh, man.
And that's the issue. Yeah. So
that's a big issue. Yeah.
That's a big issue. You have some fragments and you have a reference in Jude to Enoch, but you don't have a Hebrew version, and that's why a lot of them are, apocryphal.
Which apocryphal book was it that Jesus referenced? Wasn't it Jasher?
Well, Enoch, first Enoch talks a lot about the Son of Man.
Right. No. I'm talking about Jesus and something that he said. It seemed to me like he referenced one of the apocryphal books. I thought it was Jasher.
Well, Yasher is referenced in the Old Testament, but not by Jesus. I don't.
Yeah, I can't remember what book it was right off the top of my head.
But the book of Jude in the New Testament references the book of Enoch, but I don't recall one about Jesus. So.
Yeah, I'll have to go look that up again. It occurs to me that he did actually reference some book that's not included in the current biblical canon. I can't think of which one it is. Now, here's the last question, and it's totally out of left field and doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. But it's from Troy B. And he says, do you know if there is a name of a first vampire? And was perhaps a fallen angel the first vampire?
That's a very, very good question. And certainly blood drinking was a significant part of what the Nephilim did. And so the question gets to be, is the vampire an allegory or is it real? And if you look at Dracula, which is the most sort of well-known version, I mean, Dracula means son of a dragon. And A means son, and Dracul goes back to dragon in Greek and in Latin, and it's drinking blood. And you've got the fangs of a cobra as a serpentine sort of imagery that Dracula is drinking the blood from, helping to drink the blood through and biting, as do other vampires. And this is an allegory of the bloodlines, and this is an enemy of the Christian church in the Dracula mythology. And so this is they were drinking blood to the Nephilim were drinking blood to extend their lives after their immortality was taken away. So the question gets to be, is it real or is it not real? But certainly from an allegory as we understand modern vampirism, but it goes back into some ancient traditions, beyond, Dracula, who was built on Vlad the Impaler, who again had red hair, hazel eyes, pale skin, and was, adept of the occult. And, Vlad the Impaler was inducted, his father was inducted into the Ordo Draconis, which is another rabbit hole I won't go down today. But when you look at the sort of the mythology of this vampire, you get into Lilith, again with that owl imagery, and Lamias, that these were blood-sucking demons and female Upiers that has an etymology that goes back to the overlords and oberons of the Tuatha De Danann as well. And so typically when you look at the vampire mythology, it would probably go back more towards the Lilith type of connection. And again, so is that now a fallen angel, or is that another creature that's created by the fallen angels? There's not anything on there that we can really track that to. But when you look at the blood drinking aspect of it and this connection back to vampires, I'll just make a couple of quick connections here. So these Upiers were night operative vampires as they go back into the Tuatha De Danann and Scythian traditions. It goes back to the Romanian the Romanian word strigoi, as I recall, for witch, and popular for vampire, and is Latin for strix, meaning screech owl, just as a screech owl in the book of Isaiah, as you take that back to Hebrew, goes back to Lilith. And that's the formation for this Lamia, this blood-sucking demon that I was talking about. But an Upier would be the female version of the Oberon. right? The Ooper, or the Ubar as it comes out of Scythia. And those would be blood-drinking demons or fallen angels from the patriarchal or the male side. So I think it's still because they are more demon-like that would be the offspring of the fallen angels.
Makes good sense to me. That's some creepy stuff. I don't have too much to do with studying anything on vampires, so I'm glad you can kind of answer that question. Very, 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 very creepy stuff. Wow. Yeah, I think that about covers it. It's just interesting to me how all this different sort of what people nowadays take to be mythology and folklore actually references reality and vice versa pretty consistently. And maybe people should take it a little more seriously and do a little more research on it.
Yeah, I could not agree with more. And that's, what I like to try and do is raise people's curiosity to, continue digging in more. And as you were mentioning to me earlier, that it's nice to see the different communities starting to talk a little bit more and people seeing all the different connections because they're there. And there's just no way it's coincidental.
Yep. And again, like we were referencing at the beginning of the show, and I really believe that, in some of the old manuscripts, they're trying to describe things that we would recognize as technological, but just didn't have the wording to describe it that way. So it ended up sounding like some weird supernatural mystical thing when maybe perhaps it wasn't, like the wheel of Ezekiel, things like that.
Yeah.
How would you describe a flying saucer if you were back in those days?
Well, what's interesting about that wheel of Ezekiel, and it's similar to the word gigal that I was talking about as you go back into the Hebrew. But in First Enoch, you get these three groups of watchers that surround the throne. And you get the seraphims, which are the serpent-looking angels, and you have the cherubim, which are the four-faced individuals. But in Ezekiel, you also have this wheel-type being that also has four beings, but aren't called cherubim. But in First Enoch, you get this word, the Ophanium, as the third group of watchers that never rest. And Ophanium is the word wheel.
Yeah.
As you take that back as another version. And I think that is another type of that angelic realm. But the other argument is it's some sort of technology that, would be the chariot that God flew on. So however you want to take away from that. But I'm a real fan of, trying to connect dots and understand the original meanings.
Right on. Well, that's the best way to go. Go look at those original meanings. And, talking about the giants possibly escaping by going through gates, there's good reason to believe that could be the case. I've actually talked, and I'm sure you've heard this through Steve Quayle, where he's talked to some of the natives down in the Southwest, and they will still go to the portals to this day and talk to the things that are on the other side, which according to them are giants, and some of them are saying we're getting ready to come back and visit. And I've gotten that from other tribes down there that I've been talking to too. So that whole thing is extremely creepy, and you could be right. That's how they survived the flood. They weren't on Earth, or they were on a different, vibrational frequency Earth that wasn't getting a flood at the time.
Yep. And biblically, from a prophetic perspective, and I know not everybody agrees with me on this, but it does say, Jesus says that his second coming and a sign of the end time is going to be like the days of Noah. And a lot of people just think that that's sort of the godlessness that they're going on marrying and they're not expecting it. That's part of it. But this is part of the oration of what the signs are going to be like. And if you believe, like I do, that Jesus would use words perfectly, he uses the same words as in the days of Noah that is in Genesis 9 to describe how old Noah lived to. The days of Noah, were 950 years. So the words are exact. And so to me, that's telling us that we need to look at Noah's age, that'll be like that, both the 600 years before the flood and the 350 years that he lived after the flood. And that includes Babel, and that includes Sodom and Gomorrah, and the recreation of these beings, or survival of these beings after the flood. And that if we're at the technological level that we're at right now, and we're not in the end time. And if you extend that it's going to be like the days of Noah, then we're still catching up to that technology that built these great megaliths and portals and pyramids and cities in the mountains like Machu Picchu, and these great cities underwater that nobody can account for and underground. And to build that is a technology that we don't have today. And I think we're seeing something that's going on that's very, very similar to that, which means that not only were the gods or the angels feeding additional knowledge to the seven sacred sciences that accelerated it to bring about the first apocalypse, it's the same thing that happened as a direct analogy with the Nazis, with their acceleration of knowledge with the help from that same sort of realm. I think we're seeing that acceleration again today that's getting ready for this time where those giants and the fallen angels are coming back to the earth. The giants that could have survived, this is speculation, could easily come through the portals, or there's going to be another creation of them. But we also know the fallen angels are going to be released from the abyss that were imprisoned there in Revelation 9. And then by Revelation 12, which is the 3.5-year point of the last 7 years, all the rebellious angels are cast down to the earth, including Satan.
Oh, boy. And yeah, not looking forward to that. So
nobody should.
Yeah, well, some of those bad guys are probably looking forward to it, but I'm sure not.
Yeah.
I just I guess we got to wrap it up here, buddy. We've run over our allotted time here.
Yep.
I don't want to keep you busy all day, but I do want to thank you very, very much for coming back on the show again. It was just a blast. And would you please condescend to actually come back and do another show with us at some point?
I will come back. Just need to set a date, and I would love to come back because this is important stuff that we're talking about, I think, and yeah, anytime.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I like to keep my my viewers up to speed as much as I can on the late breaking news on what's going on with all this stuff. And you're one of the big experts on researching all these connectable dots on this stuff that most people aren't bothering to cover. And I think it's really incredibly important to understand the backstory on a lot of this stuff to get a better picture on what's really going on and how it's all connected. And again, go get Gary's book because it's awesome and you need a copy of it. I had somebody about 2 months ago got a hold of me. They had a Bigfoot encounter and they were looking for information on this. What's going on with this? Where are they from? How does all this stuff tie together? And I said, well, go get a copy of Gary's book and don't read it all at once or your head will explode. He told me to tell you that. And so I guess he was at it for about a couple months and he finished off the book and everything. And what fills me with a lot of happy feelings is that he hasn't been coming back and asking me questions, Gary. Like you covered everything apparently because he hasn't had question one for me. He got your book and started looking at it.
Yeah. Well, there are things I did not cover, and I also took 300 pages out of it just to get it down to a size that people could read and get published. So,
but right on, to let people know that you actually have been putting out those pages on your website too. So if they want to see the stuff that didn't get included, they can go there and check it out.
Yep. Or follow me on Facebook, and I put out what I think is an interesting commentary about every 2 weeks.
Right on. Well, I encourage everybody to check out, get a copy of his book, and follow him on Facebook. Check out his website. Get up to speed on all this stuff because this guy has done just a fantastic service for, as far as I'm concerned, the whole human race in spending all the time and effort to connect all of these dots to give us a clear picture of what's really going on. So God bless you for doing that, Gary. And once again, thanks for being on the show, man.
My pleasure.
All right, everybody. Well, we got to go now. So you all know the drill. And do not hug.